Hello, everybody. This is Fun Police, and I am here going to discuss the balance patch notes that we got a few days ago. There's a total of 10 changes, and overall, this patch seems to mostly be focusing on two things. One, nerfing and overall improving some of the most problematic cards at the current time, and also seemingly this consistency change that is hitting a variety of other cards. So let's jump into it. The first part we're taking a look at are four cards that have been reworked to have different wording. Most notably, these cards now, instead of discounting themselves in your deck, they instead will only discount themselves in hand. But in general, they've also received other changes on top of that. So starting off, we have the Wellington. Wellington has been pretty heavily changed. It's gone up a credit slot from 6 to 7. It's gone up an operation cost from 2 to 3. It has had its stats swapped, so it is now a 4/3 bomber. And then it says, if in your hand, this unit costs 2 less each time you give an order. So this is essentially almost a complete rework of Wellington. And I think the most definite thing is that Wellington is no longer going to be played in something like British Air. The Wellington is now a card that is pretty firmly for very order-heavy decks, and not for decks that just are playing a couple orders and then enjoy a free Blitz Bomber. It's overall arguably a little bit better, but also worse. Obviously, it's worse because you have to have a higher density of orders in order to make this cheap enough to be worth playing. If you're only playing, I would say say 15 orders, which I think is what British Air plays, I don't think Wellington really works anymore. But in a deck like, say, British Commandos or maybe even some control decks, I think the Wellington still could work its way in there because it's just still, the ability to have a zero-cost Blitz Bomber is still a potent effect. It does have a higher operation cost of 3, but I think this is actually offset a little bit by the stats swapped. By going to 4/3, the Wellington hits a little bit harder, and although it is a little bit weaker in terms of getting hurt or in terms of dying to removal, that honestly doesn't matter. Really, as we've seen, most Blitz units often get their value when they come down on one turn. The turn they come down is when they get most of their value. And the Wellington, I think, does a similar thing. You can either use it to go face to add 4 damage to the enemy, to deal 4 damage to the enemy HQ for maybe about 3 credits at minimum, which is not a bad thing, and you still leave a threat on the board. But you can also use it as something like removal, being able to kill off a problematic enemy unit, like, say, an enemy bomber, without much problem. I definitely think that I do think that Wellington is going to overall be still within decks. It's just that the decks that are going to run Wellington are now not going to be every British deck, pretty much. You're, I think, mainly going to see Wellington in, again, stuff like Commandos, maybe a bit of Control, but I think British Air definitely cuts the Wellington, which is a good thing overall. That's a nerf to British Air, so I generally agree with this nerf, or rework, however you want to say it. I do think it is weaker, but I don't think it is outright bad. Even if we don't see it right now, if Commandos or a deck that has a lot of orders gets better and becomes a meta deck, I think we're going to absolutely see Wellington within that list. Then we move on to the 34th Guards. The 34th Guards has received fewer changes. Its operation cost has been lowered from 2 credits to 1. And then it says, if in your hand, this unit costs 2 less each time your HQ takes friendly damage. So this is one of the changes that I don't like. 34th Guards For anybody that knows, I made a deck tech a while ago about Soviet self-damage, and I actually really enjoy the deck. And this feels overall like a nerf. 34th Guards kind of had one big thing going for it, was that you could play your game normally, deal, like 4 or 5 damage to yourself over time, and then play 5-year plan, draw 34th Guards, and maybe slam down several of them in one turn, potentially creating a massive board out of nowhere. 34th Guards can no longer do that. It's a slower card now, even if it does operate for one less. I think we'll have to try it out in self-damage. But seeing that self-damage was already on the niche and fringe side of the meta, making the deck slower by making its tempo swings in the mid-game take more time just feels bad. There is something to be said about 34th Guards potentially working as a better card in a mulligan or in your opening hand, because 1 or 2 bloody sickles or, just a few ways to damage yourself, and it only takes 3 self-damage and you got a free 6/6. And that's not bad, but I don't know if that's really going to offset the fact that arguably one of the biggest effects which was 5-year plan, no longer being able to give you a bunch of cheap or free 6/6s is going to really help. Maybe self-damage still wants this, but I have some real doubts about it. I overall honestly don't like this change. I wish that 34th Guards had maybe gotten a little bit more on top of this. Like maybe they could have been 7/7s if this was what had to be done, or maybe they could have done something like make this give it a keyword, like if it got guard or something like that. I think it would have helped a lot, but as it is, I have my real doubts, and I think it might even be cut from self-damage, which is a shame because I think this is a card that is really, was one of the payoffs for self-damage, and now that's just not the case, I don't think. We also have the MiG-3. So the MiG has been changed. It has gone down a credit cost, so from 5 to 4 credits. It also has lost 1 defense points and is now a 4/4. And then it says, if in your hand, this unit costs 2 less each time an enemy countermeasure triggers. I think this is overall significantly worse. MiG was already a niche tech card, but at the very least, you could get a 2-credit 4/5 fighter. Honestly, the nerf to the defense does not make any sense to me. I really don't understand that. I don't see how a 2-credit 4/5 that you have to be having to have the unit in hand triggering any countermeasure, and the benefit is that you get a couple credits off of a modest fighter, essentially a vanilla fighter. I don't know why they nerfed the health of it. I think it could have easily been a 4/5, and I know that just makes it pretty much outright better than the LA5, but why not make it like a 5/4 then, or give it a keyword, or could it get blitz, or it needed to do something. But as it is, I think the card has gone from a niche tech card waiting for the right meta to a card nobody's going to run. Even Soviet Air wouldn't want this, because it's an LA5 that it is somewhat of a tech card, and that's just not good. It really should have been a 4/5. This is the other change I really don't like. I think those are honestly quite bad. Then we have the 39th Bologna Regiment. So this one has been changed in 2 ways. The first thing is that it has lost a defense points, going from a 3/7 to a 3/6. On top of that, the text now reads, if in your hand, this unit costs 1 more each time you lose a unit. So this is overall, I think, a better change also. Bologna Regiment is essentially gotten a little bit of a nerf and a little bit of a buff, but I think overall it is a nerf. Bologna Regiment was very often a 3-cost 3/7 guard, and it was extremely well statted and very, very powerful. Even at 4 credits, a 3/7 guard outright was just good. However, now 39th Bologna is very often going to just be 3 credits, because you're very rarely going to hold it in hand and then have multiple units die to where this cost goes up. So the Bologna Regiment, I think, is overall going to be much more effective in terms of just playing it at 3 credits, and I think that's why that it lost that defense, which I think is very justified because a 3-credit 3/7 guard is just really, really strong, and a 3/6 guard still very strong, but a little bit weaker to removal and a little bit easier to trade into. I think it's overall just a good change. I think Bologna is still like pretty much one of the best British or one of the best Italian like guard units and just control tools in general, but it's just a little bit weaker because it probably would have just gotten even stronger if it only counted the units in hand, because you just play it on the turn you draw it and that's it, and you have a 3-credit 3/7. So now it's a 3/6. I think it's overall a decent little nerf. Knocks Italian control down a little bit, which is not the most meta thing in the world, but the Italians do have a really, really strong control package. So knocking it down a little bit, I think, is overall a good thing. It might open up other allies or other nations to maybe start being more worthwhile than the Italians. But with those 4 done, we then get into the 3 nerfs. And these 3 nerfs have been coming for a month or 2 now, and they're good to see. So the first one is the second Para C, which has gone from a 1/4 to a 1/2. It is lost 2 health points. This is overall, I think, a good change. Para C has been very, very strong in a lot of decks, and overall, its biggest problem was that it was a decent enough body that combined with its powerful pincer effect, all together in a 2-credit card. It just offered a little bit too much. A lot of people were asking for it to go to 3 credits or something similar, but after thinking about it for a while, I think this will also effectively nerf the card in a healthy manner. Second Para C is, as I said, is powerful because it combines the pincer effect with a good body. Now that body is no longer good. In turn, this means that you're essentially going to still play this in many decks for its very cheap access to removal. You're paying usually about 3 credits, 2 to play the para and 1 to operate a unit, in order to like kill an enemy guard, but at 3 to 4 credits, you get around to the area where there's a fair amount of removal options that would do a similar thing. Think like Amphibious Assault, Hammer, and similar options. What took Para C over the edge was the fact that it was a 1/4 body that had Fury, meaning that it was very strong with buffs, and it represented a threat on its own. 4 health is somewhat difficult to remove, especially in the early game, and you also had other things to deal with. It also made the Para C difficult to trade into because it was overall just very durable. You couldn't get rid of that. If you couldn't kill whatever the para pincered with, you probably weren't killing the para itself. This is all changed with it going down to 2 health. Now it is vulnerable to almost every removal. A lot of board clears hit it. A lot of units trade into it cleanly. Even the cheapest, like 1-credit units, are able to trade into Para C now. And it's overall just lost a lot of that potency in terms of a body. I still think it's actually very, very good because that pincer effect is very, very strong. But now, if you're holding cheap removal, most decks are going to have some way to trade into and remove the Para C if they can't remove the other unit. And when the Para C sticks around, it's going to be easier to remove. So I think that takes a good edge off of the Para C. It's not going to be applying as much pressure, and it's essentially going to be more of a removal unit with a little bit of a small body on it. Still very strong, but a good deal weaker and easier to remove. Then we move on to the Henschel HS-126. The 126 has created one of the most has created pretty much the top meta deck of the last seasons, and now it is getting a very small but significant change. What it reads is that give a friendly tank +1/+1 for each other unit type in the same line. Essentially what this means is that a friendly tank will not receive +1/+1 for a tank in the support line. Essentially that 126 has lost +1/+1 off of its buff. And this is actually quite significant. The reason being is that the HS-126 had some really strong curves where you played out like Humber turn 1 and then did HS-126 and 5th Parachute on turn 2, and you essentially made like a, what was it, a 4-6 or a 3-5 like tank on turn 2. Very hard to deal with. Now, if you just play the HS-126 on turn 2 with a tank in the support line, you're giving that tank +1/+1. And that's a pretty significant nerf. It's going to slow down Humber a fair bit, and it's going to, I think, overall weaken the deck to where it's going to have a harder time closing the game on turn like 4 or 5. And when the way Humber is, the way the Combined Arms decks are built, they're very much built around trying to win very, very, very quickly. And if they don't win quickly, they can really run into some problems. So I think that this is overall a pretty effective nerf, and we'll have to see where Combined Arms ends up. I don't think it's completely gone, but I am curious if we might see something like a shift in the deck to maybe run a few bigger cards so you have a bit more gas into the mid or late game. You know, maybe some of the more powerful cards like the Focke-Wulf Jagdbomber, or like the Panzer IV F2 or the BF 109 Trope. I never remember how that pronounces. Anyway, you know what I'm talking about. More of these mid-range style cards that Combined Arms has access to, but has opted away from in order to try to high roll as hard as possible. This has essentially taken the edge off of many of the high rolls of the deck, and although you still can make them work, they're slower and weaker to removal, and they just don't kill as fast. It's much harder to get a tank up to something like a 5, up to like a Humber up to 5 attack on the early turns without like literally like a perfect hand. And because of that, it's going to be much easier to like find time to put down guards, play removal, and overall just kind of deal with the stuff that German decks are doing, or the Combined Arms decks are doing. So it's a small nerf, but I think an effective one that is going to, at the very least, take off some of the more, some of the less enjoyable wins that the Combined Arms decks can have. Then we have United We Stands. So this has received 2 changes. It is gone down a credit cost, so from 2 credits to 1 credit. However, if United We Stand kills a unit, both players gain a credit slot. This is a card that is strange. In some regards, it is a buff because it is 1 credit cheaper and still ramps you. But on the downside, we've seen that in the other instance where giving the other player a credit slot with Overcast has generally not been the best of things. On top of that, it's important to note that United We Stand does not curve well with the current ramp roster. So for example, generally you would want to United We Stand the enemy 1-drop and then ramp from there into like, say, a 3-cost card. But I don't think that's going to be consistent. I've thought a lot about maybe where United We Stand could fit. I think ramp still probably runs it because they're just so starved for cheap removal that they'll take it even if it gives the enemy a credit slot. They're going to just try to leverage them ramping harder than the enemy. But it's definitely gone out of like most other decks. I don't like things like US Frontline, British Air, most aggro, and even many mid-range decks, I think, are completely dropping United We Stand. I don't think any of them are going to run it anymore. You just giving the enemy a credit slot that they get to use first in decks like those, I have serious doubts that any deck would really want to do that if they're not ramping and trying to take the game long. So I think that overall United We Stand definitely got a pretty significant change. it's hard to say where it's going to line up. Ramp obviously is, I think, probably the most likely place, but I do personally have doubts that it will see there. But maybe it's just that there's that Ramp is so hungry for like early game interaction that they'll still take it just because it's one of their few options. Then we get on to a couple buffs and other reworks. First off, we have Sortie. Sortie has gotten a rework. It is now a choose one card. You can either give a friendly unit mobilize or add a Frappe to your hand. And Frappe is a 1 credit order that says if you control a unit with mobilize, destroy a unit with 3 or less defense. Overall, I think this actually makes Sortie a fair bit better. Of note, Sortie is very... Being able to give a unit mobilize is a nice effect. Notably, there is some units that benefit a fair bit. Obviously, you could put on like a bomber or an artillery piece, but you could also put it on something like the Char B1. And although I don't think like those are anywhere like near strong enough to be meta, I think that it's a decent little effect. But the other thing that I'm interested in is Frappe. Frappe is just a decent removal option. Being able to blow up a unit with 3 or less defense is, I think, a decent versatile option. It's pretty easy to break up Sortie and Frappe between the two. Giving a unit mobilize for 1 credit, is a nice little option, but you can also turn it into essentially 2 credits for your mobilized deck to have cheap interaction. I think it's good enough that Sortie will see some amount of play within the mobilized decks. I don't think every mobilized deck is going to have room for it, but I could definitely see maybe a copy or two working its way into like a deck here or there. And if mobilize gets like some different decks that is interested in removal or like wants to give specific units mobilize, I think Sortie would also have a place there. I think it's overall potentially going to work better with like future interactions. The old Sortie was just really bad. Essentially, you tried to like OTK with it. I think the old Sortie was really, really bad. And only kind of started seeing play with Rima, and even then, it was just bad. So I think overall, it's a positive change. Then we have the D4Y Susei. So the D4Y has been changed to, instead of destruction, pin all enemy ground units, it has been changed to deployment, pin target enemy unit, and its adjacent units. So the D4Y a long time ago was part of a Japanese last rites deck, being that essentially planned to stall the game out by endlessly pinning all enemy units over and over and over again, and then killing people with last rites. That eventually got nerfed to the D4Y only affecting ground units, which essentially killed the card, and it hasn't seen any play since it's slow, it requires combos, and then you only pin ground units. The new D4Y is now a lot better. You are able to effectively just pin a lot of enemy units. Being able to potentially pin 3 enemy units alongside developing a decent bomber is a decent stall tool. And I think that there are a couple decks that'll be interested in it. I think a slower deck like Japan Control, even though those aren't very good right now, will honestly look at this. Having upwards of 3 being able to pin, say, the enemy's backline could give you a lot of breathing room, and they still have to deal with your 2-1 bomber. But there's also the benefit of potential pin synergy, which there's not a whole lot of at the moment, but there's a little bit, so maybe something could come around there. But I also think Japan Air might be interested. Having a 3-credit bomber that is able to do something on deployment is something that the Japan Air deck probably will enjoy. Overall, it's, I think, just a good rework. We'll have to see if it's strong enough to see play. And I do have some concerns if it turns out to be a little too good, because we've seen that mass pin before is not that enjoyable. So I guess we'll see. when it comes out, but I think Japan Air will look at it, and I think Japan Control will also give it a look. It might even be good enough to run in something like British Air. And the final card for today, Zhukov has been reworked. Zhukov has the new text, draw a random Soviet infantry. It gets +1/+1 and blitz when deployed. So this has finally, after years, just removed the combo of Zhukov high rolling with the Cuban Cossacks, which has been a plague upon the game for so long, where when it's meta, everybody hates it, and even when it's not meta, it's incredibly frustrating to face off against. Now that no longer works. In terms of the new Zhukov, I actually think that it's better. Like, just in almost every circumstance, I think the new Zhukov is more impactful and overall much more usable. Being able to give a unit +1/+1 in blitz, but just when you play it, gives you so much more control of when you're able to leverage it. A big problem with old Zhukov was often you had to run maybe like a small selection of very specific infantry in order to make it work. Because if you played like a 9-credit infantry alongside the Cossacks, Zhukov could pull that big unit on turn 1, and then you just lose out on the credit discount. That is no longer the case. Zhukov is always going to give it +1/+1 in blitz, which I think is pretty powerful. I think that Soviet value still absolutely runs this and actually will enjoy the fact that Zhukov works very well with many of its infantry units. Pretty much all of its elite infantry units, just a list of the units that off the top of my head work with it. You have things like the 845th Rifles, which are those 2-3 infantry that heals when they take damage. They love the +1/+1 and blitz to trade early game. You also have stuff like your various guard units, like 1st Rifles, Naval Brigade, among a couple others that would generally benefit from the +1/+1, but also can use blitz to trade into something that is high priority targets, or even just put it into the front line to contest the front line. Then you also just have other units, like, for example, something like 6th Airborne. If you play 6th Airborne on turn 12, you can potentially move the now buffed up 7-8 6th Airborne into the front line, and then also move and attack with your T-34 and put a ton of pressure on the enemy. And that's just like one example. You have a lot of different things. You could also do something like play 2 72nd Guards and then move it up, and then Ural or Red Banner, and now you have an IS-2 in the front line and one in the support line. I think it's actually pretty strong. And although some decks are going to lose out on the fact that they essentially just tried to high roll with it on turn 1, I think it's actually much better overall, and the Soviet decks are going to run it even more, and it's probably become an auto include. I don't see almost any unit that would not benefit from this effect. I think it's really, really good, actually. But those are the changes. So we had 4 changes that I think are varied, but they did nerf Brit Air with one of them and also Italian Control, so I think that is beneficial. We also got important nerfs. Another change to Paris C hits many of the top decks, namely Combined Arms and British Air. You have the HS, which hits the various decks such as Combined Arms mainly, and then you also have United We Stand, which is another nerf to British Air and also to various decks, pretty much any deck running the US. Overall, I do like this patch. I think it tackled a lot of problematic cards, and I think it's a good step that's going to really help the game. I think my biggest problem are mainly the changes to the 34th Guards in MiG. These just seem like bad changes, and they needed a little bit more if they were changing them for consistency, because I think they're overall nerfed, and they were already niche or tech cards that didn't see real play. But the nerfs, I think, are great, and that's probably about it. I want to thank you if you've watched all this video. Let me know down in the comments below. What are your thoughts on the balance patches? Do you think that these are going to help the game? Do you think any of them are particularly bad? Always curious to hear what you guys think in the comments. But otherwise, thank you all so much for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe because these changes come out on the 9th, and I'll probably be making a video updating with some of these. But that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.